if you do not, okay, okay. So it will mostly be my screen. But if you would rather have your camera off, that's fine. So I will, share my screen. Okay. So I know most of you know me as the training coordinator. I've been with Literacy Pittsburgh for 5 years now. But just to give you a little bit of background of where my interest in this topic comes from. My role at Literacy Pittsburgh, I organize and lead the tutor training workshops. I also teach a citizenship class, and I tutor individual students in English language learning and citizenship. And in a prior life, I spent 20 years teaching foreign language and literature. My area of specialty was Francophone African literature. So I have lived and studied in France and in West Africa. But even prior to that, I had another previous life where I worked in international study and travel. And that included both organizing programs and doing advising. So my interest, one of the things we used to do were orientation workshops on what we called then culturally puzzling differences. So my interest in this topic goes very far back. So that's a little about me. I would like to know a little bit more about where your students come from. So if everyone could just drop in the chat. If you work with more than one student, feel free to drop that in, and we'll have a look. Okay, so I'm seeing Ecuador, Ukraine, Algeria, Moldova, Brazil and Turkey, Syria, China, Venezuela, Russia, another student from Venezuela. Okay. Nepal, Myanmar, Uganda, Libya, India, another from Mexico, South Korea, Italy. This is amazing. Okay. So as you can see, as we tell you in the training, our students come from all over, which makes this question about learning about cultural differences extremely challenging. So, a question I frequently get from tutors is, I want to learn more about my students' culture. And that was kind of the question that prompted this talk. And it's an excellent question. I mean, why do we want to know more about our students' culture? In order to better understand your student. Sometimes they might act in such a way that you're not sure. Is my student quiet because just as an individual, they're shy? Or is it in their culture, students are not as talkative and don't ask questions of their teachers? Or is it something I'm doing? Okay, so having a little bit of cultural framework we hope can help tease that out. Another reason is we want to avoid offending. There are a number, as we know, of do's and don'ts and taboos in cultures that we are concerned about violating. And I just discovered, I can tell you that this happens to the best. I will not give the name of the organization, but they are a leading literacy organization in the country with fantastic materials, resources, trainings. And they just put out a new ESL curriculum that used a thumbs up symbol in a lot of their activities to show that the student had done it successfully, only to learn that that is a very offensive gesture in Afghan culture. And with the arrival of Afghan refugees, it was pointed out to them, and they are now having to redo all their materials. So we try to avoid offending, but this is a learning process. Okay. And also the interest in showing respect for another's culture. Students bring a lot of knowledge and skills to the table, and we as teachers want to honor that so that it's more reciprocal relationship. And finally, another reason is to know how to most effectively teach our students. The more we know about them, about their expectations, the more successful we can become as tutors. And then finally, there's just genuine interest in other cultures and wanting to make a connection. Teaching is a human endeavor, right? So I wish that I had a sheet I could give you with all the answers about your student that would satisfy all these needs. Unfortunately, it's a lot more complicated, as we will see as we go through this presentation. So this is what I plan to talk about today. Just very briefly, what we mean by culture. You could write whole books on this. And then we're going to look at 3 models of culture and intercultural communication and see how these models have shifted and changed over time. And then I'm going to talk about some types of cultural difference and cultural awareness, how we can better tune our lens to our own cultural expectations. And finally, we'll look at cultural difference as a topic of study that you can actually introduce into your lesson. And I have a number of activities to show that. And then we'll wrap up very briefly talking about culture and language. So we always include culture, even from the very beginning levels. And often we start out teaching culture as food, as holidays we celebrate, as clothing and dress, as leisure activities, as various systems we have to navigate. All of these are very visible aspects of culture and easy to introduce students to how we do these things in America. But another way of thinking about culture is the idea that culture is like the water in which we navigate. And we are like fish in water. So that it is what surrounds us and is not visible to us. Okay? We take it for granted. We don't truly think about it until perhaps we might find ourselves out of water. And we even have the expression of fish out of water to describe the feeling when you are in a situation where nothing feels familiar. You're not sure what to expect or how to behave. But fish out of water, and if you have traveled or spent time abroad, I'm sure you're very familiar with this feeling. But it doesn't necessarily have to be going to a foreign country. What's interesting about the fish out of water metaphor is that it just suddenly makes visible to you some cultural assumptions and expectations that you might not even have been aware of. So one example that came to mind when I was thinking about this, when I was an undergraduate, I worked in an office, the International Study and Travel Office, where we offered peer advising to students who were interested in work, study, or travel abroad. We were not part of the university's official study abroad office. It was founded by 3 former Peace Corps volunteers who had built it up over time. And when I got the job, I was very proud of myself. I had presented myself as someone who was an independent worker, self-reliant, didn't need a lot of direction. I could be trusted. And at one point, my supervisor came to me and said, "We've hired a new student, and she's going to need a lot of direction." And she was a student not from America. She was very quiet, not a self-starter. And I remember at the time feeling a little incensed, like, well, why would you hire someone like that? All the qualities that I had been led to believe were necessary to succeed to get a position and succeed, suddenly seemed not to be in question. And of course, fortunately, my former Peace Corps volunteer supervisors were a lot wiser than me, and that student brought a lot of other qualities that were particularly useful in a setting where we were talking about engaging with other cultures. But that was a moment where suddenly the water became visible to me in a way it hadn't before. So if you have a pen and paper handy, there are a lot of you here, so we won't be able to discuss these right away. We might have time in the question and answer at the end, but I would like you to take a moment to think about an experience where you felt like a fish out of water. And in particular, what did the experience reveal to you about your own cultural expectations? So I'll give you about 2 minutes to reflect on that and jot it down. Okay, so stop where you are. We'll hopefully have a chance to come back to this. But I think it's a useful, productive question. So this is a definition that gets at that sense of being the fish in water. Culture acts as a filter or set of lenses through which we view and interpret the world around us. And again, it's often not visible to us. But in addition to culture being a lens with which we view the world, an important component of culture is the fact that it is transmissible through generations. Okay, so it is learned and passed through generations, includes the beliefs and value systems of a society. And so it includes features that are shared and bind people together into a community. So this is an aspect of culture that can become particularly fraught for students who are adult learners who are coming here and who are concerned about at once adapting to their new culture and at the same time being able to pass down their own cultural heritage to their children. And that can include religion, rites of passage, language, dietary habits, leisure activities, all those visible things that encapsulate a whole system of values. So we're going to look at 3 models of culture, intercultural communication, some of which might be very familiar to you, and some of which have been rethought. Starting with the cultural iceberg, which has been around since around 1970, this idea, and also culture shock and cultural competence. Okay. So I'm sure many of you are familiar with this notion of the iceberg model. This was coined by Edward T. Hall, who was an anthropologist. This was in the 1970s. And it gets at the idea that only a small portion of what we call culture is actually visible. And this is surface culture. And that much of what is driving these visible behaviors are out of our conscious awareness. So under the waterline, if you will. And these have to do more with our beliefs, our attitudes, our expectations, our assumptions, concepts of justice, fairness, etc. So this is a very useful model, but another researcher named Roberta has done kind of an update on the iceberg model that she calls the culture tree. And the culture tree still gets at this idea that there are observable manifestations of surface culture that manifest certain patterns in that culture, and that there is a deep and unconscious system of beliefs and norms that are driving those surface manifestations. And in between, okay, there's kind of a middle ground of unspoken rules. Okay, things like child rearing practices, or the nature of relationships, what friendship might mean, or making eye contact, or personal space. And so these are all connected, okay, but they are more or less accessible to our awareness. And the nice thing about this culture tree model, as opposed to the iceberg, is one, that it shows how all these different levels of culture are connected. You have, and that it can move both ways. You have outside influences, the tree taking in sunlight and the roots taking in water and nourishment from the soil. So these are both coming and affecting each other in multi-directions. The other nice thing about this model is a tree exists in an ecology. Okay, it is connected. It is a living thing, okay, not an isolated iceberg, and also not frozen in time. Okay, so this kind of shows the possibility that cultures also change over time. And again, I can give you an example. If we learn such and such, so many facts about a certain culture, and that is a set of facts that we have learned, and perhaps our experience in that culture has reinforced those facts, and then they kind of get frozen. And I can again share that as a longtime teacher of French, I could have expounded at length on French attitude towards eating and food and meals, that they don't eat walking down the street. They pay attention to what they do. It's something distinct in and of itself. It's a leisurely activity. And then I met one of our French assistants more recently, who talked about how great she felt walking down the streets of Paris, holding a Starbucks cup in her hand, and that it made her feel dynamique. It made her feel productive. It made her feel energetic in a way that completely shifted my ideas of, or required me to expand and rethink some set ideas I may have had, because cultures change. Part of that could have been due to her age. Part of it could have been due to the fact that she was interested in America. It's often very hard to tease these things out. Okay, so it's more a question of making us aware of our own assumptions behind them. Okay, the other model, and this may be very familiar to you. We used to use this model in our training and our handbook, and this is culture shock. And especially if you have spent any time living or studying abroad, again, I'm sure this probably resonates with you. And this is the idea that you, when faced with an unfamiliar culture, you go through a series of stages, starting with the honeymoon stage. You're very euphoric, you're excited about the novelty of it. And then after a certain amount of time, that kind of wears off and you descend into a level of great frustration as you try just to navigate your way. Why can't they do things the way they do them at home? It can lead to hostility, irritability, and it's kind of a low point. And then eventually you reach a stage of gradual adjustment where you start learning more about the culture and can more readily navigate, and eventually reach a stage of adaptation where you are kind of entering into a bicultural lens where you see different ways of doing things, both equally valid in their context. Okay. And this has been actually kind of adapted for newcomers learning the language. Instead of culture shock, it's called the U curve of cultural adjustment. And the one idea is that this is not necessarily linear. You can be cycling through these various levels at different points. Okay. But one limit to this model is that it was largely based on research of college students and business people who were going abroad. Okay. And you can see this by showing you the full model, which includes a period of reentry shock, where upon reentry, you kind of go through the same U curve once you come back home and eventually reach again adaptation. Okay. So the source and the purpose of this model is kind of shown by this source that I got it from, horizonUnknown.com, which is a travel website. Okay. So the migrant experience is not quite the same. Okay. And so there are some aspects of the culture shock model that might apply, but people who are coming here, whether they are immigrants who have chosen to come here, or whether they have experienced forced migration, that they will not have a reentry. Okay, they are here to stay, and that complicates their relationship to culture, to transmission of their culture, to practice of their culture. So I would strongly recommend, we'll make these resources available to you, but this Post-Gazette interactive story about refugees coming to Pittsburgh is very, very powerful, and could broaden your picture of what people experienced. Okay. So the term that has been coined to get at the experience of migrants coming to a new place is called cultural bereavement. Okay. And this is a complicated sense of grief that people go through. And again, this is emerged out of mental health workers who realized that most of the categories that they had, like PTSD or culture shock or simple depression, really didn't get at the experience of cultural loss. And this was just very recently, about a week ago, in the New York Times, a wonderful article that kind of takes you through this this notion. And it was developed, the term was coined by Dr. Maurice Eisenberg in 1991. He's a psychiatrist and professor and researcher from Australia, and he had been working with Cambodian refugees in Australia. And so this is, and of course, this is an extreme case of people he would have encountered in his practice, but it can be experienced on a milder level. But it's the feeling of guilt over abandoning the home culture, difficulty completing cultural obligations. You know, for instance, if your culture as an honorable person, you are supposed to spend 15 days mourning your dead with all sorts of ritual practices, and your American employer only gives you a day off, that can lead to very deep feelings of grief. And so at the limit, this can block people from adapting and getting on with everyday life. So some research on Ethiopian refugees in South Korea, I believe, this is all very recent, the notions of cultural bereavement, but they have pointed to some practices that offer antidotes to cultural bereavement. And that includes, most of it has to do with maintaining ties to your cultural community and to spiritual practice. So things like the Bhutanese refugees here offer yoga classes to help people with stress. They even go through mourning rituals, which might be very unfamiliar to us. I think it's a very common Western assumption that talking about trauma helps you. But for some people, that only increases their pain. Where among the Bhutanese, having a chance to cry is very therapeutic. And so they have sessions where everyone is crying together. Okay. Cultural activities, dance, sports, any type of engagement that keeps you connected to your community. So one thing to keep in mind with your student is try to find out, you know, do they have any community here? Do they have any connection? And is there any way that you could help them establish connection if need be? Reach out to your program coordinator. We can work with Isaac and we can help get people connected. Okay. The other model is cultural competence. And this was developed particularly for people in education and healthcare who work with people from other cultures and realize that it really is important to know some background knowledge of another culture in order to more effectively work with them. And so there is a lot of material about, you know, telling you, giving you background knowledge of other cultures. And I've seen the database that UPMC keeps for all their doctors. But as you can see from just the number of countries we saw represented at the beginning, it's really hard to have really detailed knowledge about so many other cultures. But there are a number of resources. I'm going to present some here. At the end of the session, I'll drop a link to a bibliography of these in the chat, but it will also be available with the recording later. But the core, the Cultural Orientation Resource Center, this is developed for agencies that work with refugee resettlement. And it is a very useful resource. You can see they have background information on refugees from Syria, from Afghanistan, from Democratic Republic of Congo, and they just give you a lot of background information. Okay. It has shifted to a different site, so they still have material archived on the site I just showed you. This is their new site, Cultural Orientation Resource Exchange, but same thing. They have background information on recent refugee populations. And another useful source is called the Cultural Atlas. This actually comes out of Australia, but they have a number of countries listed that give you some very important background information. And another Post-Gazette article. This is really interesting. You just click on these countries, it shows you where it is in the world, and it brings up a video of an immigrant from that country who has come to Pittsburgh and settled. And you can hear their story, and it has a brief text giving you some background. Okay. So one of the problems with cultural competence is it takes a lifetime to become what we might call competent in another culture, right? And the danger is that by having a little bit of knowledge, that we then kind of put our students into a box where we assume everything that we see and observe is due to that particular culture. And so particularly for organizations moving into a community or working with a community, the idea of cultural humility has taken hold. And this is not to reject the notion of learning about other cultures, but it is to also become more aware of how our own cultural lens guides our responses. And that means really, really listening to your student, to your learner, and not letting what you've learned about a culture dictate your actions and responses to the student. And also that the idea of competence suggests that you can, at some point, learn all there is to know about culture, that there is some kind of end goal where cultural humility is just an ongoing process. Okay, so this is how these three models have evolved, from cultural iceberg to culture tree, from culture shock to culture bereavement, and from cultural competence to cultural humility. Okay, so I'm now going to talk about some very some very large categories of cultural differences that researchers have categorized. And mostly it has to do with becoming aware of when we are working out of our own culture's framework. It's so easy to interpret something somebody does and think, if I had behaved in that way, it would mean this. Okay? And it's good to know that that might not be what was intended. So one of the biggest categorizations of cultural difference, and again, these are cultures that exist on a continuum, individualism versus collectivism, that individualist societies, which of course the United States is one, we're very focused on independence, individual achievement, self-reliance. For learning, a lot of it happens through individual study, reading on our own, and individual contributions are important. Where a lot of our students come from more collectivist societies, where it's the group and interdependence that is prioritized, okay? And members work to make the whole group succeed, okay? Group dynamics, harmony are important more than individual success. Another one that's important for, particularly for communication, is the idea of high context versus low context culture. Okay. So a high context culture, if you have grown up and spent your time among a very small community where people know each other, they share the same rules, they share the same values, you don't need to spell everything out. There are a lot of unspoken rules, nonverbal behaviors that communicate. Where in low context cultures, where we interact a lot with people we have never met before, people we have never seen before, a lot of information has to be spelled out, made explicit, and available to everyone to view. So you can find people from high context cultures might be very indirect in the way they communicate, and we are much more direct. And this might be something that your student will have to learn, for instance, in communicating through writing, through email or business situation. Okay. And another one, of course, is relationship to time, and cultures that place a very high value on being punctual, compartmentalizing time, where other cultures, what they call polychronic, might see time as more fluid. And again, might have a different hierarchy of values. If you encounter a friend, you are going to stop and be with that friend rather than make the appointment with someone who might not be as close to you. Okay. So as one researcher in a work called Cross-Cultural Dialogues put it, you might have one American child who has grown up learning that it's good to be an individual. It's good to be self-reliant. You don't go behind someone's back, okay? And you can set out and do what you accomplish, okay? Where there's a will, there's a way, okay? And you don't beat around the bush. You get straight to the point, okay? Whereas someone from another culture might have grown up learning that you identify primarily with your group, starting with the family, and that you are dependent on others, even as they depend on you, and that you would never confront a person directly to save face, and that it is God's will that is paramount. So you can imagine confusions or even conflict within individuals that might result from these encounters. Okay. And a lot of it requires us to think about our assumptions about learning. Okay. In Western learning, students believe in the promise of a future reward from education. We expect that they will become independent learners. We expect that they have a certain background, and that print, writing, reading is one way that they will demonstrate their mastery, and that they are accustomed to school thinking, okay? School-based tasks, school ways, academic ways of critical thinking. So what do we do with all this? Okay. And what I would recommend is that we use cultural difference as a topic of discussion with our students. Okay. And I would start with the series that we have begun using. Okay. It's called Standout. And on each book, you see a cover, okay, of one individual standing out. Okay. I think this makes for a very rich topic of exploration with your student. What does it mean to stand out? Okay. In your culture, is it desirable to stand out? Is it seen as a good thing to stand out? And there are many, this is published by National Geographic, so you will find stories of a lot of individuals who have gone off and done entrepreneurial things or exploration things, and that can open to discussions of individual accomplishments and community. There's no one answer. I just suggest it as something that you make visible and point of discussion. Okay. And I'm going to quickly go through these, but these are a series of other activities that can make these cultural difference a point of discussion. A couple of them come from Literacy Minnesota, which is a very rich source of materials. And what I liked about this one was the question that they came up with to interview someone about their culture. Who can you call aunt? Who can you call uncle? Rather than just saying, tell me about your family. Okay? This gets at something that might be very culturally distinct. Okay? Okay. Another one is dialogue journals, which we have included in our training, where you write to your student and they write back to you, and you have an ongoing written conversation. This works best if you do use it as an ongoing practice, where you read it together and then you can model. You don't correct it. You can model some vocabulary and structures in your own response. But this is specifically focused around a series of questions about culture. And another one that I would point out that I think can be very rich as a question: what advice would you give to someone who is going to go to school in your home country? And so asking students to talk about advice draws on their own knowledge. I would even add, what advice would you give to a newcomer from your country coming to Pittsburgh? And you could narrow this down to various things about going to the doctor or about children in school. Okay. This is another activity that comes from a book called Crossing Cultures in the Language Classroom. And it's specifically focused on the idea of saving face, which in many cultures can be very important. You don't want to appear to make a mistake in front of someone. You certainly don't want to point out their mistake. And so you can just ask students to rate on a scale of 1 to 10, how comfortable would they be doing these things? Okay. You could make up your own about a number of different topics on cultural differences that might cause discomfort. And then this comes from the same work. This is what we used to call culturally puzzling differences, that they are calling cultural incidents. And so it's just a little scenario or anecdote that points out an occasion of cultural misunderstanding. And so you can use this to read it, talk about it, try and figure out what happened. Okay. This is an example of an American who was very quick to call a new student she met her friend, and her friend pointed out, no, we are just acquaintances. we have coffee together and talk about little things, but we are not friends. And the first student became insulted, and that was the end of their friendship. The notion of friendship can be very different in cultures. So for each one of these, they have they give you an analysis. Okay, let me see if I can find it. Okay, I guess I don't have it. They do go through an analysis to help you kind of suss out what might have happened. Here's one from the student's point of view, who walks into a store in the US and is greeted by the greeter, and he is surprised because he doesn't know this person, and leaves a little bewildered by the encounter. Okay. So using these as a topic of analysis and discussion can be very fruitful. Okay. And again, here's a little bit of analysis that can help guide you. I'll give you the reference for this book. Okay, but there are whole series of them. And actually, there's another book, the Cross-Cultural Dialogues, talks about how you can create these situations yourself, or generate them from your student. Have them talk about a situation where someone acted in a way that confused them. Okay. Another activity is using proverbs. And again, on the theme of friendship, here are a range of attitudes toward friendship encapsulated in proverbs. And for our advanced students, this is a textbook we use, Compelling American Conversations, that among other activities draws heavily on proverbs as a way to discuss cultural attitudes, differences. Okay. And I would encourage you to actually take the culture tree and show it to your students. And you can start by talking about some of these simpler things, okay? But then move into some of the less visible things as you build trust and your student seems willing to explore them. Okay. So to conclude, I just want to point out part of exploring cultural differences is becoming aware of how your own cultural expectations might be driving your response. So notice how you respond. If a student acts in a certain way that that you might not expect. Okay, and also keep in mind, it is very useful to have cultural background, cultural knowledge, but your student is still an individual. There are a lot of other factors: age, how long they've been in this country, gender. There are just a number of factors that shape who we are. Okay. And also, as always, your student is your best source. Asking questions and exploring these things together can tell you a lot more than any culture capsule could. And finally, while this all seems that it can be very complex, the most important thing you are doing for your student to help them adapt to their new life is by teaching them the language. That is the most empowering knowledge that they can gain. And so just be aware and keep doing what you're doing. And with that, I will stop and open for questions. Feel free for questions just to go ahead and unmute yourself and jump in. And if you'd like to share your fish out of water experience, we'd love to hear it.
Well, I'll share one that involves fish out of water from two different standpoints. As a Lutheran pastor in Germany, I was required to teach religion in the public school with they assumed that I was a pastor and I knew all about this. And I had no materials and no agenda, no expectation of what I should teach. And I had second, fourth, and sixth graders for 2 hours a week. So I was a fish out of water. And in the sixth grade class, there was a tall, good-looking, looking a little bit like a Middle Eastern kid, Mario Gutfleisch, born and raised in Germany, spoke the dialect as well as anybody, our local Southwestern Pfälzer dialect. And but when we came to a unit on prayer, he was just totally disruptive and just acting out all kinds of stupid stuff until I found out that, well, excuse me, he was disruptive the whole time. And when we got to prayer, he was very attentive. And it turns out he was Muslim. And in our educational system, if you were not Catholic, you went to the Lutheran religion class. You're either evangelisch or katholisch. So he was, even though he's Muslim, he came to my class and hated everything until we got to prayer. And then he was great. And that's when I found out that he actually, I mean, nobody was sensitive to his cultural difference.
Yeah.
Because he was so obviously a German kid.
Right.
Mother was Muslim and his father was secular.
So that's
Which
interesting.
also made him Lutheran.
Right. But it wasn't visible until that moment.
Yeah.
Right. And a
So
lot
he
of the
was a fish.
research.
He was a fish out of water as well as I.
Yeah. Spiritual practice and the continuity of spiritual practice runs very deep a lot of times for newcomers to the country as a way of maintaining connection to their culture. Yeah, wow. Thank you for that. Keith, I see you're unmuted. Did you want to share?
Yeah, I used to live near a therapeutic horse riding stables, and I was always looking for something to volunteer with. And it was like, okay, I've never lived on a farm. I'm not really a country person. So I went and tried it because I like working with kids. So that worked out really well. I really liked the environment. Everybody there was very helpful, very nurturing. And I've actually turned that into a part-time job.
So from being a fish out of water, you were able
was
to
very much a
learn to
fish
swim.
out of water.
Yeah. So did it reveal to you any assumptions you had previously had about yourself, your knowledge, your view of the world?
Well, I had lived near farms a lot of my life, and I actually never grew up on one, never worked at one, but I just didn't know the lifestyle. Like I said, it was very close to where I lived. Thankfully, the lady saved that property where it would have been a subdivision by now.
Okay.
So it filled a lot of squares for me. I ended up becoming a mascot. I mean, they got me involved in the publicity. It was a nonprofit.
But I like what you said about it was a safe, nourishing environment that
Yes,
that helped
that's
you
what kept me there. They were
make
very
that switch.
sincere.
Yeah.
When she had some issues with some horses' health, otherwise the facility would have went out of business. But they like I said, they were so nurturing and honest and friendly that, you know, she had donors that came through when most stables would have gone out of business.
And so that, as tutors, you know, that's one important thing that you can do is make your student feel safe, and safe to make errors. And you too should feel, comfortable enough to ask your student if you're not sure about some cultural behavior that might not be familiar to you.
Yeah, I had friends and relatives ask me, why are you doing that? You never grew up on a farm. You don't even like country music. It's like, I'm like, well, I like the people there. Like you said, it was very nurturing.
Yep. We get a lot of people who come to Literacy Pittsburgh classrooms downtown because they like being there. But it's also not just us, it's community. So does anyone else have, Betty, Sister Betty, I see that you're unmuted. Would you like to share? Okay, maybe not. Amy?
I think of lots and lots of situations where my student, I also have a daughter-in-law that's from South Korea, but where the expectations of how you treat either your tutor or your teacher, or how you treat your elder, is so different from our culture in a way that's extremely uncomfortable. I actually had a student just the other day say, if you would come to my house being my honored teacher, I would get down on my hands and knees and welcome you to my home. And I said to her, and I would be really uncomfortable when you did that. I was invited to one of my students' homes once with my husband for a holiday, and we arrived thinking, oh, that would be nice to meet her family. And we were seated at a table and no one ate with us. We were served as the honored guests, which was, from my culture, extremely uncomfortable. And what I found over time was, first of all, is to stumble on these, but to also explain on the other side what is expected behavior, comfortable behavior, because they have to function in our society. I'm not functioning in theirs. And that becomes, I think, the real challenge is to stumble on these and find out. I was at one of my students' houses as a sort of end of the year.
Sorry, we
goodbye.
have 40 seconds left, so can I stop you here? But that's an excellent point. Is part of our role is to help bridge them into American culture. And so in discussing these differences, part of it is to explain why we do things this way in America. It doesn't mean that they have to abandon their original culture, but you are trying to help transition them, understand how it makes people feel, okay, and why we do the things we do. Okay, they're going to cut us off in 3 seconds. Thank you.